This is the Texas Land Guys podcast, hosted by brothers Tim Dosch and Tom Dosch. With their partners David Marshall and Trip Rich, they have built DMRE, the leading land brokerage in Texas. With decades of experience brokering deals between landowners and real estate developers, they take you inside the deals that move the market.
Welcome to the Texas Land Guys podcast. Today I've got Trey McGhin here in the studio with me in Dallas. Trey, good morning.
Good morning. How's it going?
Doing good. Tim, you've got David Marshall with you there in Houston.
That's right. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody.
Good to all be back. Back again. I guess we haven't all been together on the podcast since December. So good to be back and exciting to be in 2026 and working on deals and kind of in a, to see how this year plays out. I thought today would be interesting to talk more about something we're running into a lot just as we're listing sites and as we're out representing developers on sites. Just what is it that we feel like separates kind of the top 1% of developers?
Yeah, I think it's a great topic and something that is important because every single day, deciding who to work with, whether it's on the buyer side, helping developers find sites, or the seller side, we're representing a seller, trying to find the best buyer for the site, not just the highest price, but who's actually going to follow through and honor the word and close in a timely manner. It's just a daily thing that we go through. We've been doing now for a couple of decades. So we've had a lot of experience with a lot of developers who aren't in the 1%, and then the ones we're really thankful for that we consider to be the top tier, top 1% developers.
Yeah, and I think it's easy for, I'm looking at it from a landowner's perspective. You see that big price on an LOI and that immediately shoots to the top of the list. And, I can understand why a landowner or a seller of any property would think that. But, while that is important, at the end of the day, I don't think it's the most important thing. And I think that's what the topic's going to be about, or the conversation is going to be about, those 3 or 4 or 5 things that the top 1% does.
Yeah, that's right. So Trey, when you think about top 1%, what comes to mind for you?
It's a good question. I think certainly tenacity and transparency are 2 big things. There's obviously access to capital is a huge point, right? Because the top 1% of developers ultimately are the guys that have the capital backing to get stuff done. But
doesn't everybody have money?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm pretty sure everybody says they have money.
Right. I've got a partner. And I just think, when we're working on deals as brokers, it's the guys that communicate really well.
Yeah.
If we're representing someone on a site to purchase a site, and they're communicating with us about every step of the way and how they're strategically going about the development and the issues they're running into, those are the guys that ultimately they get deals done and we do a lot with. It's the guys that, you're putting stuff under contract with and you never hear from them except when it's like this deal doesn't work. That it's just hard to ever get a lot of stuff done with that type of developer.
Yeah, you brought up some really good points there. I mean, I think we'll probably want to get into each of those in a little bit of detail. Maybe we start with the biggest one, which is capital.
Yep.
Just because obviously at the end of the day, if you don't have money, you could be a really good developer, and we could think about developer as a company, or we could think about it as an individual. Because a lot of times it's actually probably better to think about it as an individual. But if they don't have access to capital, they're not going to be able to perform. And I think that is something that maybe a lot of people just don't understand. Because to your point, David, every LOI that comes across, there's some write-up or company brochure on how they have a partner and they have money and how they can get it done. We obviously have been in the business long enough to know, as soon as they start saying, I've got these 5 partners, and it's BlackRock and Carlyle, and then it's oh, okay, you're just putting sites under contract and showing them to the same people that everyone else is.
Yep.
And that's so different than our owner backs the company and writes checks and and buys deals. And so can't really talk enough about capital. And it can actually be really hard, especially if it's a newer group to the market, to try to pin them down on where the money really truly comes from, because people really do try to promote so much because they know that they're not going to get the deal a lot of times if they're honest. And obviously the 1% are honest. And
that's right.
And so I think maybe we talk about capital for a minute.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about capital is there's so many times we've had groups come in and say, I have this fund, we have $1 billion fund or however big the fund is. And then they go into our contract and it's like, well, we can't use this for the fund. We got to go raise the money outside the fund. And it's like, well, I thought you said that this was a fund deal. And so that's something to watch out for sure. And then on the institutional capital side, like you mentioned, whether it's Carlyle or BlackRock, there's a group, everybody's showing those guys, deals, but there are certain developers that, Carlyle is actually doing all their deals. And we know that, just by being active in the market and seeing who capitalizes deals. So there are certain developers who are actually credible to get institutional capital and they have a really good track record with it. And they have deep relationships where Carlyle's looking at their deals first. And then there's everybody else who's showing their deals to all the same institutional partners, but they're just in the stack on the desk or in the email inbox, and they're not actually getting looked at and really considered. And they're very lucky if they get capitalized by one of those groups.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's access to capital, and these groups see a ton of different deals, and the groups that rise to the top or that are on the top of that stack are the groups that execute. They do what they say they're going to do. They perform. They show their partner good returns, and that's why they have access to capital, because those things, and they do a good job. And I think within all that is they communicate too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a business that's pretty easy to get into, to create a logo, and to go draft an LOI. It's pretty amazing how easy it is to go put a property under contract, because all you really have to do is convince a landowner. And like you said, David, a lot of times it's just a high price on a page. But to convince a landowner that they should sell you the property. And so we've seen a lot of that over the years. But then you compare that to what we call like the blue bloods in the business. The guys that have done deal after deal after deal, and I think their time a lot of times is really valuable to them. So they're not just going to go and put a site under contract. Versus there's a lot of groups that. And it's a lot of times it's the ones that don't have capital. The only way they can actually get capital is by having something to show to capital. So they just put sites under contract. And it's just kind of part of the game that's played.
Yeah, one thing we talked about before we started recording is it's interesting how there are certain developers in Houston that we consider to be the top tier strong developers, but maybe in Dallas or another market they're not. And part of this is not just the company, but the actual individual that is calling the shots and doing the deals and making the commitments on the ground and having to work through all the problems that come up on these deals. And we've had some really great development partners over the years that really made that developer, and speaking of the company, a very strong player in a local market. So I think that's an interesting point to make as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tim. Part of talking about that beforehand was I made the comment that I hadn't really seen it earlier in my career where developers were putting sites under contract almost with this plan to retrade. I just didn't really see it. And I've started to see it a lot more. And it's probably a function of just how competitive the market is. So developers are just, okay, I've got to do it. It's funny, there's a lot of, we'll hear this a lot, like, well, I have to do it because that's what everyone else is doing. Like I have to just agree to a short timeline that I probably can't hit because that's what everyone else is doing. But then a lot of times the group they'll throw under the bus and be like, that's what they do. And they drop all their deals. It's a group that we've closed like 10 out of 10 deals with. And we're like, what are you talking about? That's actually not the group. It's kind of like, it's not me, it's them. It's like the group's saying that. The group's being like, everyone else will say they don't have money. A lot of times they don't have money.
Right.
And that's actually what they're saying. Or like, I've never dropped a deal. Well, you dropped one with me last week.
Yeah.
So
that's a classic. That's so funny how many groups will say like, we never drop deals. And we know that they dropped like 3 deals this year, but they'll say it.
There's always a caveat. They just don't finish. It's like after feasibility, after we work hard, once we like get the closing statement from title.
Once we have a partner.
Once we have a partner. Yeah. But a lot of times they don't actually say that. They'll just try to leave it. Right. But and I think capital, again, probably the most important. Because, regardless, there is, if a sponsor developer has access to capital, it can make that individual's job just a lot easier. I mean, it just can. It's probably a lot harder for the guy or girl that works at the shop that doesn't really have capital or very much access to it. Like their job becomes way harder to then go out and get deals done. Yeah. We've seen that too, though. We've seen, really strong developers, just like strong individuals. They just have to do a lot more work to go actually convince somebody to get it under contract and then go and find the capital. And for some deals, the deals are just good enough to where you're like, this is a deal that if things check out like they appear to check out at the beginning, someone like that may actually be able to get it done.
Yeah. And there's another caveat to that is there's the groups that have access to capital, and then there's the groups that have, backing by their founder, backing by, balance sheet, and the ability to be really flexible with capital rather than just a 95-5 split with an equity partner. There's groups that we work with in DFW that we've closed deals with where, their founder or whoever personally guarantees the debt on the construction side, which people don't like to do. And because of that, they get better thresholds with lending and better thresholds with equity partners. And so those groups just time and time again, they have more financial flexibility. And so when things come up where the market changes or the deal changes, whatever, they're still able to get it across the finish line because they're not just tied to a perfect threshold on the equity.
Yeah, that's a great point. You brought up a really good point, Trey, because access to capital can kind of be like access to utilities. Like my site's got access to utilities. It's like, what does that mean? They're like 2 miles away, but it's got access, And so everyone will say they have access to capital. Like everyone will. But then the question I think is, there's some really good developers like an Endeavor or a Alliance. Alliance doesn't have a founder that like writes checks. They don't have a balance sheet but they do more deals than anyone else.
Yeah.
And so if you're just looking really high level, you might look at their pitch and presentation and think like, oh, they don't have money. You don't want to work with them. But the reality is we've seen them get a lot of some of the most complicated, challenging, and then just more deals than like anyone else. But then you compare that to, someone else, maybe like a Rosewood or someone that they truly can balance sheet it if they need to. They're the other side of a really strong capital group. But both those groups can be great buyers. But then there can be groups like both of them, where the first one can call BlackRock, but maybe BlackRock isn't going to do a deal with them. And the second one could write a check, but they just never do.
Yeah.
It's always like, well, we have the balance sheet, but they just never do it. And so I think that's where capital needs to be a big part of the conversation. But then beyond that, beyond capital, where do you guys want to go to next on just what separates?
I was just going to say, just a clarifying point, because I think people assume so often that either you have money or you don't have money. If you do have money, then the capital's not a problem, so you just close. But the reality is about 95% of these deals, people have access to capital, so they go raise the money. So no one's sitting at the table who actually has the money that's going to close the deal. They have to go raise the money. Yeah. And the strongest players, that's still true of them. The maybe 5% or less that would actually use their own money to do a deal, it's very rare. But those guys typically are very conservative and are not your highest paying buyer and just don't offer on very many deals. And so I think that's a misconception because a lot of sellers will think, well, do they have money or do they not have money? And it's like, well, actually no one really technically has the money just sitting there to go close on your site and capitalize a deal. That doesn't make them a bad buyer. It's their track record of actually putting the money together and be able to close by the end of the deal.
And a lot of times if they do have the money, it's like, that's the last resort.
Yeah.
Let's go try to raise it from a third party first. We can't do that. Go down the list. We get no. All right. Last case, effort is we'll use our own money, our own capital.
Yeah. But to answer your question, I think where to go next, I think a big point that Trey kind of started with is character. I think character is so big. And I think to your point, David, character does tend to play into capital, access to capital, because if your character is not very good, and if you have a checkered past with success or with not honoring commitments or honoring your word, then you're probably not going to have consistent capital there to invest in your deals. But I think, character, you can think of integrity, honesty, communication. I mean, some of the developers I respect the most will be very honest with the seller and say, hey, we think we can get this done. Here's all the challenges we're going to try and overcome. And here's why we think we can do it, but we may not be able to. And they're just very honest. And it sets up a really good relationship to work together. And then we've had other developers who just overpromise and everything's going to be easy, no problem, we got this. And then the first problem that comes up, they bail on the deal. And so I think, we could define character probably a lot of different ways. There's different things that impact character, but honoring your word, following through, having a tenacity about you that when things get hard, we've had some developers that have overcome I can think of some deals where it's like there's an environmental issue, there's a wetlands issue, there's a floodplain issue, there's a utility. There's like, 7 or 8 things that one of them could kill the deal. And the developer just persevered and just figured it out, and they got it done. And there's not very many groups who will do that.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, not to change subjects, you could also say top 1% of brokers too have all those traits in integrity, communication, the whole list that you just went through. But I think the big thing is communication. Yeah. And that when they communicate to us as brokers and we can relay that message to the seller, it goes a long, long ways. Like you said, it establishes trust, establishes a relationship, and that goes very far at the end of the day in getting deals done, because most of these land deals, development deals, they are going to probably run into a handful of problems along the way that weren't expected. And so unfortunately, when those pop up, you have to solve for those. And if you can't solve for them, the site's not going to close more than likely, at least at that price they have it under contract. So if you can establish early that relationship and communicate with a landowner as you come across these problems, sit down with them or get on a call, explain to them the problem, explain to them kind of how you're going to go about solving for those problems. I mean, you're at the end of the day, unless they close on that deal, that's wasted time for that buyer.
Yeah.
But what the seller gets out of that is, all right, these are the problems our site has. And even if they didn't close on them, they've given us information that we now know. And they've also maybe shared with ways to solve for those problems as well. So they're getting something out of it.
Yeah, that's good. It makes me think of just communication on the deals that we own as Ascent, because every deal is complicated. So, we'll buy deals and we do all the work we can on the front end to solve the complications, make it easy for the future buyer to come in and know they have utilities and what they can develop and the use and all that. But still, inevitably on every deal, something pops up. Like every deal we've sold as an owner on, an Ascent deal, something's popped up, and it's being able to work through those with the buyer. We've had some really good buyers. And I'd say, fortunately, we've mostly had really good buyers on our deals. But, when a buyer's not willing to communicate or try to build that relationship with the landowner, it makes it really hard. So that's something we try to do is, as brokers, like when we're listing a property, a lot of times we'll offer up, like, let's do a buyer interview on one of these processes, just because let's see if like the seller and the developer can get along, because they kind of do need to get along. At the end of the day, buying a land deal, trying to maximize the price and sell it for development is not going to happen normally in like 2 months. It's going to happen in like a year. It's going to take time. And so it's kind of a partnership, whether it's truly a partnership or not. And that word gets thrown around. It can be kind of cheesy. But at the end of the day, it is important that there's some likability. And it, needs to be not just for the sake of it, because some developers are just like incredible promoters, just really good at selling themselves, because that's kind of part of the job. But it is important that there's some likability and a good open line of communication, because I think a lot of times there's enough issues, like real issues that pop up on deals that need to be solved. If it stays where it's like we stay fully as the middleman and there's not really like true people on either side, where they don't really know that the other person is trying, like the developer's trying as hard as they can because we picked the right developer, and they just don't trust. We've had deals recently, Trey and I were like, there's no trust. The seller will not trust that anything the developer is sharing, which we can validate. Like, we're meeting with the mayor, or we're meeting with engineers, and like, we're validating like, these are real things they're sharing. But if the seller can't trust that the developer is sharing like truth with them, that deal is probably not going to happen. Yeah. And a lot of deals fall apart because of that. Just a lack of trust, a lack of good communication.
Well,
and there's a lot. Oh, go ahead, Trey.
I always think about, to that point, oftentimes the quicker you can get the two principals talking and cultivating a relationship, I often think the higher a probability of the deal closing, right? Yeah. Because you think about our business and you think about how many times a deal closes when it's scheduled. It's like very, very rarely does a land transaction close on time. And so if those two can't have a relationship and get along, it's very, very difficult to see that through.
Yeah, that's a great point.
There's so many times and I think it's just natural human nature to do this. It's like you've got the buy side, you got the sell side. So you got two different sides of the deal. Once they go under contract, though, you need to work together. And that's where communication, trust, a relationship needs to be established, because it takes both sides to push that deal forward and get it closed. It's not always all on the buyer. There's stuff that the seller can assist with and help with and understand, which will allow that buyer to push the site forward and get it closed.
Yeah, and I even think when we're representing owners and we've had a lot of marketed process that result in best and finals, that result in buyer interviews, it's very difficult to pick the right buyer, right? It can be very challenging. You can have great options, but I think about, when we're talking about communication, who is the group that's just following up nonstop throughout that process, telling you everything they're learning as they're going to try and win the deal, versus the group that you basically hear from them every time the offers are due. And that's like only when you hear from them, right? And so when you're trying to guide a seller on who to pick out of that situation, who is the top 1%, it's like, this guy has been on it. He's been studying every little thing about the deal.
Yeah, that's good. And that's Trey making me think of something we talk about a lot, which is the developer listening to us? And I know that your pet peeve is developers not listening to you, because it's extremely frustrating where where a lot of times this is obviously when we're representing a developer and, we have all this knowledge of all these other deals happening, the market, everything. And we feel like, okay, we know how to go get this deal. So I'll hear Trey talking to a developer, and then he'll come in and be like, the guy didn't listen to me at all. It's like, this is what it was going to take. Inevitably, the guy doesn't listen. He submits something else. Oh, we didn't get the deal.
Yeah.
I guess that's why we didn't get the deal. And so it's interesting. Some of these developers kind of like where they show up at offer deadline and you're like, I didn't even know that they were looking at it. Like, I think he talked to me like when I first sent, the email blast out, and that was it. And then it's like full price offer, or they just call you when offers are due and it's, where do I need to be? And you're like, well, have you studied it at all? And meanwhile, to your point, you've talked to this guy that realized all these other things going on with the site and he's solving them, but it's going to have a financial impact. And so I think that's a great point too, is like, are they communicating? How are they communicating? And are they listening? And we see that a lot when they'll call and we're working on behalf of a landowner, but we're trying to give guidance to the developers so that we can improve the terms for the landowner. And we're like, you really need to be able to increase earnest money or increase the price, or the timing is really important. And then they'll come back with something totally different. And they're like, all right, now did I get the deal? It's like, well, you didn't do anything that we told you needed to do. So I don't think so.
I mean, one of the biggest things that you guys are alluding to is being willing to look at the negatives and the challenges and just be honest about that from the beginning. And, what your plan is to solve those things, or maybe sometimes they're not going to be easily solved, but the way you're going to try and solve them versus these guys who come in and, we have so many sites where we'll get the highest offer. And it's like, we just know it's not real because we know the guy hasn't looked at any of the problems. And it might sound kind of almost weird that you want to really care about how they think about the problems or the negatives of the site when you're trying to sell something. But I think one of the best things you can do as a broker is actually to lead with some of the negatives, but then say why it's still a good deal, but then talk about how are we going to overcome these negatives? Because that's the reality. The deal's not going to close if those things don't get addressed. And there's a lot of times people just want to get past all that and go tie it up and then get to the negatives. And then that's when you have either a busted deal or you have a retrade on price, because now we're having to deal with what we should have dealt with in the beginning.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tim. It puts developers in a difficult position a lot of times where they want to be honest about the negatives, but then they know that if it's a competitive process and the next guy is just saying like, I've done it all before, I'm not worried about it. By the way, here's an extra 500,000, then they're probably not going to get picked. Like they're probably not going to get the deal. And then a lot of times that comes down to what that landowner really needs is a good advisor. He needs a good broker helping him, because to Trey's point, we've had a lot of recent listings we've taken out. We've gotten great offers. And so you'll be sitting there looking at, when you whittle it down, like 3 good offers. And I do believe there's like a right offer out of the 3. There is a best offer, but unless you go pretty deep, a lot of times it's hard to know like which one is the right offer.
Yeah. And it can be really difficult to convince an owner of like why they should give up 10% of land value and we're having to guide them on like, this is a top 1% developer. Like the probability of the deal is a lot higher of it happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's certain deals we look at and it's like, if this developer goes in our contract, it's like a 10 or 20% chance they close.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like more than a half court shot. And then there's other developers where like, even if it's a bad market, there's probably a 90% chance they close, unless there's something really unusual we don't know about the site that just makes it not a deal, which can happen to any deal. But they're not even like at the table unless they know they can get this done.
Yeah, I know we're talking about buyers in the top 1% there, and the ones that listen are in that top 1%. Landowners also, sellers need to listen too, because that's valuable information that they're getting about their property. And hey, a lot of times it's negative information, but it is what it is. But sometimes they just don't want to hear it. But they are problems with the property that will need to be addressed in some form or fashion with whoever ends up buying it and wants to develop it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We as brokers, yes, our job's to go sell a property for a landowner and get them the highest price. But also our job is to get them market feedback and how the market perceives their property. And that's a big part of what, they pay. That's part of our service.
Yeah.
And it's not always, a rosy image. We want it to be. And yes, our goal is to push the pricing and get you that highest price. But, it's also, you got to hear the good with the bad, or the bad with the good. And so that's important information for them to know and hear and understand.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, David. And I think that landowners a lot of time struggling to listen and understand what they're receiving. The challenge can be they meet with 3 people and they hear 3 different things. And I think it goes back to, I know we're talking about buyers, but it goes back to the importance of having a broker that's doing more than just that one deal. Because it's hard. Like Trey and I talk to landowners and we'll market sites and you get 10 different answers from 10 different developers. And so if you're a landowner that's never been a part of this before and you're trying to navigate that, that's really hard. Because like one person's telling you they can pay this, the next person's telling you that like it's a horrible site, and then this guy's saying, and you're just getting mixed messages. And I think what we're able to bring is context around, okay, we've recently closed our 800th land deal in Texas. And so we have all of this context. We know we're making, over 1,000 offers a year on behalf of developers. So we have all this market data. And so you take that into account and we can say, all right, well, these 7 guys, like we can tell you why they're saying that, but that's incorrect. And so let's focus on these 3. And maybe there is some truth to what these 7 guys are saying, but let's focus on the 1% again. This is why they're going to be able to make it happen, and they're going to be able to get this deal done.
Yeah, I think a characteristic we can add is creativity. Just to your point there, Tom, when you get these, especially a competitive marketing process where you get maybe 10 multifamily offers, it's amazing the difference in pricing that comes in. Sometimes it's different product types, the way they want to handle, what all the different development issues that come up on a site. And you'll get, like you're saying, some guys are like, or girls are like, that can't be solved, or that doesn't work in this market or whatever. And then there's someone else who's like, oh yeah, actually it does. We've done it before. We did it over here in this other market. We're willing to do this. We can get it done. And so that's why it's important to talk to a lot of different developers, not just take one. Even some of the strongest developers sometimes will misread a site or misread a submarket. And so including enough developers, but then having the experience to know, okay, there's these different deal challenges that are coming up. Which ones are real? Like, where are the real objections that we're getting? And which ones are just like an objection that they're giving us is not really that real, that can be overcome. And being able to kind of filter that through for a seller and help them make a smart decision.
Yeah, Tim, a great example of what you're talking about is we sold a site earlier this last year in Denton to JPI, and we ran a process on it. We got a lot of offers on it. It was going to be a challenging rezone. And to speak to creativity, it was a 25-acre site. A lot of the offers were for either multifamily or SFR, BTR. And there were some offers for just traditional single family because it was zoned residential. And initially we thought multifamily probably doesn't really have a chance on this site. Like it's probably just not going to get zoned. Well, what JPI ended up doing was they ended up dedicating about half the site to the city as a park, and then only built their apartments on half the site. And so they were able to pay a higher price than all the residential guys to do that. They were able to get the neighbors on board because now the neighbors are like, this is great. We just got a 12, 13 acre park across the street from our houses. And then it actually aligned with the city's future land use on that part of the site that they were developing. But no one else thought to do that. They were the only one that came up with that concept. And when there were all these trees they had to save, and they were able to do all that, because it was like, we're just not going to touch that half of the site. It was kind of like crazy, because, a lot of developers are trying to maximize every piece of the site, but they were just trying to think, how can we get this deal done? Like, how can we get creative? And I was really impressed by that, because I hadn't come up with that creativity for the site. So that was a good example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's great. Great example.
And Trey, you mentioned that earlier with some developers here, that with like things like developing in the ETJ.
Yes.
A lot of people just been like, oh, I don't do that. Like, I don't understand how it works. It's too complicated. And then there's other developers that are just like killing it doing it.
Yeah. I mean, we've closed several deals in the ETJ for multifamily development that some developers had dropped, didn't think there was any way you could get it done. And it's just finding the right guy who knows how to get it across the finish line and really think through that. But the other thing with creativity too, beyond just like the side of it with how do you navigate site challenges, is it's all the other things. Like you mentioned meetings with mayors. We closed a high rise last year in Dallas that there was an easement that the city owned, and the developer needed that released by the Parks Department in order to get their development done. And, the developer was out having dinner with city council members and coming up with like, what is the solution here? And ultimately the solution to get them to release it was he had to help them design a park in another location. And it's like just being willing to do those type of things that if it's not up the fairway, most groups would just walk away.
Yeah. And a lot of that too is a seller being able to recognize this developer is like legitimately trying to solve a real issue on the site, instead of just that easement has no place, because that easement didn't make any sense. So it's like that easement has no place. I'll just find somebody that isn't worried about it or something. And
you mentioned the Holt Lunsford guys on the deal we closed last year. It's like they weren't getting an answer from the city on something, so they just went and sat down at the city until they could get an answer on it.
Yeah, kind of old school, just showing up until someone's willing to talk to you. But it worked.
One thing that's tough for sellers, and I can understand a lot of times why sellers are not trusting, because as we're talking about these developers who are very honest and do everything that they say they're going to do, and they're, overcoming all these obstacles to make sites happen. And the reality is a lot of developers, maybe the majority, are not honest. They tell sellers what they want to hear. They string sellers along. I mean, some of the stories we've seen are just, you feel so bad for some of these people, because there's some of these developers that they'll drag people out for years and they don't really have a chance to get it done. They're just keep extending it. They're not really solving problems, or they're making issues of things that aren't a big deal. And so, there's also some negative examples. There's a lot of negative examples, unfortunately, which is, I think, why a lot of sellers do struggle to trust. It's like, who do I trust? If I've been burned once, how do I know that this person is actually being honest and this is a real issue? And so sellers will tend to be very hard in their negotiations, because they just think, if I'm really tough, that's going to just give me the right result, which a lot of times is not the right approach either.
And that's where we as brokers come into play.
Yeah.
We're out in the market. We know the buyers. We know what they're working on, and we can share with them, hey, they've got, 5 deals they're working on. They're probably not paying your site the attention that it needs to be paid. And, our client needs to, trust in our experience and our market knowledge, and just being out in the market and knowing who the top 1% of the buyers are, and who are the buyers that we can trust, and who are actually rolling up their sleeves and working hard on it and spending money.
Yeah, we can say, they're making a big issue out of this, this issue on the site. This is a non-issue. We know it's a non-issue. This can be resolved. This is just a wrong buyer. Let's go find a different buyer. Or we can back them up and say, you know what, this is a legitimate issue. We can go find another buyer, but they're going to have to deal with the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
So let's figure out, how do we resolve this? How do we work together? Or maybe give them some time or a price reduction, because we want to get this deal closed for you.
And the reality is everyone has to drop deals, because things happen on deals that you don't know about, and it's reasonable. Like, there's just deals that don't make sense. And so we all have signed up buyers that ultimately didn't close for a variety of reasons. A lot of times up here in DFW, I feel like it's zoning related or some kind of entitlement or, they needed they needed bonds or they needed some kind of incentives from the city. And that was all known, but they just weren't able to secure them. But I think that's just important. It's like at a minimum, you want to pick that right buyer. But then as a seller, you just got to understand there's going to be things to work through. I mean, I'm still blown away by some of the stuff that we come across that I've never seen on deals before that happens. I mean, it's just that kind of bizarre, some of the stuff that we'll run into. And so I think it's really important as a seller that you're picking that right developer. And then you're also just recognizing, like you were saying earlier, David, once you're under contract, you really want to be communicating and you really want to be working together because there's going to be real issues that pop up. And it's that discernment of understanding. I think that the challenge sometimes is the discernment of a seller understanding they keep saying there's an issue and they keep needing another extension. Is this like their problem or a site problem, or is this they don't have a money problem? And so that's where we can really help to say, like, that's a real problem, or I could bring you 5 other buyers right now that could solve that problem because they all have money. And the real problem there is money. Right. It's not, it's not the site. And so that discernment can be difficult for a seller if they don't have, somebody advising them.
That's another thing we hear a lot too, is to allude to what you mentioned earlier, Tom, is we've got capital, is we hear a lot, we've never dropped a contract. And like you said, everybody's dropped a contract. So that immediately raises a red flag that that's highly unlikely.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, these deals, when we're talking about deals that take 3 years to close, in a lot of cases that we close deals every year that take that long, right? And and it's almost in a lot of ways, it's almost like a marriage at that point, right? And so it's there's a single family developer here in Dallas that we do a lot of deals with, and at any point they may have like 15 deals going. But one thing I always admire about them is they never hide behind email, they never hide behind a phone call. Like if there's a real deal issue, they're always willing to drive out to the seller's house and meet with them and talk to them about it, because they understand in a lot of cases this is like their whole life. When you're dealing with a seller who's lived on a property for 20 or 30 years, like sometimes this is like the biggest investment they've ever made in their entire life, right? And so having somebody who's willing to just go that extra mile, that always seems to result in a deal getting across the finish line more often than not.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is sad when a developer doesn't do that, and it's just like a termination letter to the title company.
Yeah.
It was like this huge effort for and we've seen it with it'd be like our grandparents.
Yeah.
It's like they're selling their property and there's this huge effort and
they're like, what do you mean? I spent $7,000 on attorney's fees.
And then they just drop it.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I hadn't thought a lot about that until being on the sales side with Ascent, and we're spending money on attorneys to sell properties, but the developers that really just put properties under contract and drop them, and they don't mind, they have their attorneys and all that, but just thinking about what a seller is going through, with that whole negotiation, not to mention sellers never forget the price they had, and so right or wrong, it's like I had $5 million and the developer wasted their time and dropped it, but the disservice it did to that seller that now forever has $5 million in their head a lot of times. So that is a good point. That's unfortunate that'll happen. And I really respect the 1% that recognize that people are involved.
Yeah.
And that this is these are real people. Maybe we couldn't make the deal work. Maybe there's some deals that there's no way to make it work. You're not able to come back and say, reduce the price, extend the time. But a lot of deals, there is a way to make it work. And that maybe you just have to part ways because the seller wasn't ready for that, but just being willing to go have the hard conversation.
Yeah. And as a broker, one of the worst feelings is when you convince a seller to take a certain buyer or a certain offer, and then they terminate the deal at day 90, and you find out the only thing they did the entire time was maybe get a survey done and have one meeting with the city. It's gosh, you really didn't do anything.
And a lot of times those are the developers that I'm thinking of a specific deal where before they signed up the deal, they told the owner, don't pick that guy that won't do anything, won't do a survey. And then they literally did nothing for an, and it was so frustrating because it was lying. The person just lied on the call.
And there's no heads up. We're going to drop the contract. You find out from the title company when they send out the termination agreement. It's hey, appreciate a heads up.
We remember those things. Because for us, we're trying to sell properties for our clients.
Yeah.
And we're, ultimately we're not doing this to practice. And so I think that kind of goes back with when people are dishonest and they don't do it the right way, that'll catch up to them.
Yeah. And I think the thing, it's funny as a broker, there's things you have a short-term memory about, but then there's things that you have a long-term memory about, right?
Yeah.
And I always remember the groups that when things were really hard, whether it was the market, whether it was something with the site, they still managed to get it done. And so then the next time you're in a best and final with those guys or representing a seller, it's like, I can go to bat saying those guys got it done when nobody else could.
Yeah.
It's been so helpful to having offices, across the Texas Triangle, so Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, because we'll get new buyers coming to the market all the time. And we can, call you guys and say, hey, what do you think of so-and-so? What deals have they done? What have they dropped? And normally one of our offices has worked on deals with that buyer or knows like, they're tying up sites here, but they're dropping them or they don't have a good reputation. Or there's been many times you guys have said, man, like meet with these guys. These guys are strong. Like they're buying deals. They have capital. Like they're honest guys. So I think there's a big benefit, not just our local experience, but getting the experience from the other offices. Because there's normally groups when they come to Texas, they're not just doing Houston deals or Dallas deals or Austin. They're normally picking at least two of our markets. Hopefully Houston doesn't get left out and they pick Houston too. But normally they're going to be active across the state, not just one market. And so we're going to get a feeling for how real they are.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tim. One final thought I had on this was, and I'm thinking, I have examples in my head of, developers that have stayed at a company a long time, and then those that have moved to different companies. And I could classify both as good developers. But I think a lot of times it's a little bit of a red flag when you got these developers that are moving from company to company. And some of the strongest developers that I can think of, and when I say strong, it's like they do what they say they're going to do. They have access to capital. They close deals again and again. And then the deals they close actually make money and perform well. So they get to stay in the business. They've been at that company for a long time, and they've been running that platform for a long time. And then there's some where, the joke is like, are they still at that company? And that was like 12 months ago. And it's like, no, they're not. They're moving on to somewhere else, and just kind of never really wanting to like set roots down all the way. And, then a lot of times, a lot of those developers will just kind of always blame it on the company they were at. Like, oh, it was their fault, but it's always that company's fault. And so after a while, for us, we're trying to navigate that and advising our sellers on whether this is someone you want to give a chance to. And so to Trey's point, you're going to remember the ones that deliver when times were hard, or that have just been consistent and, didn't leave to go to another company in the middle of a deal you were working on, which then left things really, really challenging for that deal.
Yeah. And the relationship's so important, but then there's the other side of that. There's a developer that, you guys have closed deals with at 3 different companies, and it's like, he's the guy. You follow him around regardless of what company he hangs his shingle at, like he's going to get it done.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely, to your point, there's definitely cases where it's not just how long someone's been somewhere, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been very fortunate. We've got really good relationships with a lot of different developers who are very good developers and who I think fall into that top 1%.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's taken 20 years of being in the business and establishing those relationships and learning that about them, and them learning that about us as well.
Yeah. Don't you think that, David, that also plays into just kind of like what we talk about with our business, is just having a long-term mindset? The guys that have the long-term mindset, both in personal life and in business, they seem to be the ones that are always in that top 1%.
Absolutely. Yeah. No doubt about that.
Well, good guys. I think we want to go work with the top 1%.
I'm fired up. Let's go do some deals.
That's right. And our clients too. That's always our goal, is to help them through these, marketing processes we do and these deals that we list. And some, there's some listings that are tough listings. And so you don't have a lot of offers. So it's like, there's an offer, and then maybe you take a chance. And then there's other ones where you're fortunate and you got 20 offers, and then you're really getting to be able to go like super deep in the weeds and kind of pick the good from the good and the best, and, have that conversation. So,
and we want to work with the top 1%. We also want to be in the top 1%,
Mm-hmm.
Strive to be in the top 1% also. So,
well, we obviously make mistakes. We don't close every deal. And I think that's something for us, is being honest about that. And we've had to tell clients, like, we missed a BOV value. Like there's plenty of times where we do a good job, and there's times where we don't, we miss something. And I think the good developers say the same thing. They're honest. It's like sometimes the challenge isn't the site. It's like they had an assumption that was wrong, or they misheard, they didn't know something. And so I can think of developers that just were honest and the deal still went forward and happened because they didn't try to hide the fact we're all people. So we're going to make mistakes. Like we work so hard to not make mistakes, but we're still going to make mistakes. And if you're out there saying like, I never make a mistake or don't work with someone because they've made a mistake, then good luck finding anybody to work with. So, well, guys, this was a good conversation. So when I mentioned the topic, I didn't know if we'd be able to fill the time, but I felt like we could have gone on for a little bit longer.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's fun to think and talk. I think as we're all talking, we're all always thinking about examples and deals we've worked on and stuff. So thank you to our audience for listening. A lot of the top 1% are listening, so we really appreciate that. And definitely follow us on LinkedIn and definitely reach out to us if you have any questions about your land. Send us an email, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And we'll look forward to being on the podcast here soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. If you have questions about land you own in Texas, send us an email at texaslandguys@dmre.com and follow us on LinkedIn to stay updated.